In the short run, real GDP and the price level in the economy is determined at the intersection of the downward sloping aggregate demand curve and the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Take a look at the graph. In the short run, the real GDP in the economy is Y, and the price level is P. Since aggregate demand is equal to short-run aggregate supply, there is no reason for producers to change the level of output, and there are no upward or downward pressures on the price level. Suppose there is an increase in aggregate demand, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift from AD1 to AD2. In the short run, this will cause a movement up along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Real GDP will increase from Y1 to Y2, and the price level will increase from P1 to P2. However, the short run is not the end of the story. In the neoclassical view, aggregate supply in the long run is a vertical line at potential GDP, where there is full employment. We represent the long-run aggregate supply curve, labeled LRAS, as a vertical line at potential GDP, labeled Y star. Long-run equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. If aggregate demand shifts to the right from AD1 to AD2, then in the long run the price level in the economy will increase from P1 to P2. But real GDP in the long run will not be affected. It is important to understand, from the neoclassical perspective, an increase in aggregate demand will only cause inflation in the long run. It will not cause an increase in output. Let's examine the transition between the short run and the long run. Say the economy starts in long run equilibrium at the intersection of LRAS, SRAS1, and AD1. Real GDP is equal to the potential GDP Y star, and the price level is P1. Now let's say aggregate demand shifts to the right. In the short run, this causes a movement up along the short-run aggregate supply curve, resulting in an increase in real GDP to Y2, and an increase in the price level to P2. However, potential GDP is not affected by a shift in aggregate demand. Therefore, at this point, real GDP, Y2, is greater than potential GDP, Y star. The difference between these values in the circumstances is called an inflationary gap. Current output is greater than the full employment level of output. If real GDP were lower than potential GDP, then the difference would be called a deflationary gap. The inflationary gap cannot persist in the long run. Because the price level in the economy has risen, the price of factors of production will rise. For example, workers will demand higher wages for their work since the purchasing power of their wages will have fallen. An increase in production cost will cause short-run aggregate supply to shift to the left. Because of the higher production costs present in the new short-run equilibrium at the intersection of AD2 and SRAS1, short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left from SRAS1 until a new long-run equilibrium at potential GDP is reached at SRAS2. The new long-run equilibrium occurs at the intersection of AD2, SRAS2, and the LRAS curves. Compared to the previous short-run equilibrium, real GDP has fallen from Y2 to Y star, and the price level has risen from P2 to P3. Compared to the long-run equilibrium before the shift in aggregate demand, the price level has risen from P1 to P3. While real GDP has not changed, it is still at potential GDP. In the neoclassical perspective, because long-run aggregate supply is perfectly elastic at potential GDP, any change in aggregate demand will ultimately lead to a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve that returns long-run real GDP to potential GDP at a new price level.